Hello my fellow weirdlings, it's Margot, and today I'm talking about some old superstitions about cemeteries, many of which are still practiced today. So if you're ready to get spooked and spine tingled, keep watching. Is there a difference between a graveyard and a cemetery? It turns out there actually is, though they're pretty much used interchangeably these days. The only real difference is that a graveyard adjoins a church and is the yard where burials take place, whereas a cemetery is a designated burial ground that isn't associated with a church. But both cemeteries and graveyards have long been regarded as places to avoid, preying on some of our deepest fears of ghosts, the undead, the dark, and our own mortality. So it's no surprise there are a lot of superstitions surrounding them. Let's talk about a few of them. First off, location is everything. Being buried in a grave on the south side of the church is said to be the holiest location in the graveyard. So I guess it makes sense that being buried on the north side of the church would be considered unlucky due to the lack of sunlight. It was also considered unhallowed or unconsecrated ground. Throughout history, that area has often been reserved for criminals, suicide victims, people who were unbaptized or had been excommunicated from the church, people who died violently, and indigent people. They often weren't even given grave markers. One argument for relegating these poor souls to the north side of the yard instead of the majority of the parishioners, the ones deemed worthy of a proper burial, was that if the churchyard gate was on the south side, people wouldn't pray for the graves on the north side because they wouldn't be walking that far and passing their graves. Churchyard gates were usually positioned on the south or west side, but yet the west, though sometimes near the gate and therefore conveniently located for thoughts and prayers, was also reserved for those that were seen as less holy. I found one quote from 1806 that said, "The north is looked upon as the devil's side, and the west for unbaptized children, soldiers, and strangers." I guess you'd have to live and die according to a very strict set of rules to decay in the prime real estate, or receive any prayers. There was even so much superstition around ending your own life that many suicide victims were buried at crossroads to the north or west side of the church and outside of the churchyard entirely, and those burials took place at night without a religious service. Another old superstition tells us that the first body buried in a new graveyard will always be claimed by the devil, so I don't know if planting that corpse on the south side of the churchyard will help cancel that out or not. Germans found a loophole a very long time ago for avoiding this curse by burying a dog or pig in the first grave instead. But it's also unlucky to be the last body buried in a cemetery, because the last one in has to stand watch over all the others, apparently for eternity. The thought of this eternal guardian job was so unpleasant that in the old days, if two bodies arrived for interment at the same time, their loved ones would race to get their deceased in the ground first. Your positioning within the grave also matters. Graves should be oriented so that the corpse's head points to the west, with their feet pointing to the east. It seems this custom dates back to ancient pagan sun worshippers, believing that the east represents new life and a new day, while the west represents an ending. Burying their dead east to west represented a full life. But the practice is now mostly attributed to Christian and Jewish beliefs that the final call to judgment will come from the east, and the dead will rise from the grave facing that direction. And you're supposed to be buried face up, unless you're a witch. Not a real witch, the Christian fanfiction kind accused for miscellaneous, arbitrary reasons. This should prevent you from being able to cast spells on the community. But if that didn't work, they'd dig you up, strip you naked, turn your clothes inside out, then rebury you face down. If their lives still weren't going perfectly, I guess they'd have to find someone else to blame. Of course, Muslims position their dead to face Mecca, the center of the Islamic faith. Since Christians and Jews were some of the first to organize and manage cemeteries, they set the traditions that the majority of modern Western cemeteries still practice today. Speaking of Christian beliefs, this one's a doozy. So we all know headstones are markers that indicate where a person is buried. But one old European superstition gave them a dual purpose. In the 1500s, headstones were also laid over a grave to prevent the deceased from escaping. There's a Christian belief that the faithful will rise when Archangel Gabriel blows his trumpet, while 14th century Europeans were afraid Christians would do that too soon. and apparently the thought of premature Christian zombies running amok was as unpleasant as being obligated to babysit the dead for eternity. In some English cemeteries, headstones were actually placed at the foot of the grave to keep the corpses from getting up and wandering around. There have even been extreme instances where the dead's feet were cut off to ensure they couldn't walk anywhere before the resurrection. This eventually developed into mort safes in the 1770s. If you've ever seen an iron cage over an old grave, that's a mort safe. Those serve the dual purpose of preventing the dead from rising and deterring grave robbers. Today, headstones go at the head of the grave, and we just don't have the same problems we used to have with grave robbers, though footstones are still in use as well, identifying the lower boundary line for the burial plot. If you're digging a grave, there are rules for that too. First off, never bury anyone on Thursday or Saturday because it's bad luck. Never leave a grave open overnight because it could bring death to the community. That one actually seems pretty practical, since somebody could fall in the dark. Not that anyone should be in a cemetery after dark anyway, because that also causes bad luck. However, walking by an open grave is actually believed to cure some illnesses, such as toothaches, boils, and incontinence. Another good reason to fill a grave quickly is so that mourners aren't waiting by the gravesite all night, and they probably would feel obligated to, because leaving a grave before it's filled will cause another death to follow. Though I did find another superstition that said you're fine as long as you stay long enough for the casket to be lowered into the ground. But after filling a grave with dirt, don't immediately put your equipment away. Tools used to dig a grave used to be left at the grave sites for a day or more after burial, because moving them too soon was believed to bring bad luck. Sounds like a good way to get your shovel stolen. Also, if a casket slips while being lowered into the grave, another death will soon follow. But if the casket doesn't go into the grave easily, it's because the devil doesn't want the dead. I guess that's supposed to be a good thing. Once the grave's covered up, don't go digging around in it. An old common superstition warns that plowing or digging into any land that's had a body buried in it is bad luck. I assume that doesn't count when digging more graves. Another old superstition says that sharing a grave with a stillborn child is a guaranteed way to get into heaven. It's thought that the adult will guide and comfort the baby, helping them find their way. There are other superstitions about burying children, but I know that can be a really triggering topic, so we don't need to get into all of that. A common belief among many different cultures and religions is that people who are pregnant shouldn't attend funerals or even visit a cemetery. There are several reasons for this, though none of them make any real sense. One is the belief that being around death could cause a stillbirth. Another is that vengeful spirits will snatch the baby away. My personal favorite is that the fetus could be possessed. But others argue that the emotional stress could simply be harmful to the mother's health, which could in turn affect the baby. It seems to me that the death itself would be the most stressful part, probably not so much the funeral in most cases. But yeah, if you're pregnant or not, and anticipate an event would be too stressful for you to the point of harming your health, definitely skip it if you can. One thing a lot of graves have in common are flowers. Of course, there are superstitions around those as well. Both real and artificial flowers are placed on graves as a sign of respect and a symbol of purity. This has been a common practice for thousands of years. In ancient Rome, people planted flowers at burial sites because they believed the spirit of their loved one would wander the gravesite and enjoy the flower's beauty for eternity. But some flowers grow on graves naturally. In North America and Europe, it's believed that if wildflowers appear on a grave, it means the deceased was a good and virtuous person. If only weeds grow on a grave, it means the deceased went to hell. Well, that's cheerful. And finding a 4-leaf clover on a grave predicts that a friend will soon be visiting you to give you money. That's better. While we're on the subject, never take flowers from a grave or the spirit of the deceased will haunt you. And if you uproot and replant a living flower from a gravesite, it won't grow. In the Jewish faith, small stones are usually left on graves instead of flowers. They believe that the body, like a flower, blossoms and then fades away, but the soul, like a solid stone, lives on forever. It's said to be bad luck to take anything from a cemetery, and anyone who does will end up returning more than they took. It's even said that collecting epitaphs, or gravestone rubbings, will make you lose your memory. Oddly, superstition also counterintuitively tells us that if we take some black dirt off a grave and put it under steps that we have to walk over, we'll always have good luck. There are also lots of other things you shouldn't do at a graveyard. One of them is pointing. In Hawaii, it's believed that if you point at a graveyard or tombstones, a spirit will latch onto you and never let go. Another superstition claims that if you point at a grave, the spirits will see you and send bad luck your way. Yet another claims that pointing at a grave will make your finger rot off. Japan has an interesting variation on this. In Japanese, there's a connection between the word thumb and the word death, with a very similar sound. The thumb literally translates to parent finger. Because of that double meaning, a Japanese superstition is to tuck the thumbs into fists whenever they enter a cemetery. This protects one's parents from an untimely death. Japanese superstition also warns us against openly speaking about death or inviting it in any way. A common superstition throughout North America and England is that it's bad luck to stand or walk on someone's grave. In fact, a person who walks over 3 graves will die before the year's over. It's also believed that if you have a sudden chill or moment of dread, someone has just walked over your future grave. The origin of this common belief and turn of phrase, "someone walked over my grave," is thought to have originated from Britain's Newgate prison, which was in operation from 1188 to 1902, where prisoners would have to literally walk across their own gravesite on their way from their cells to the executioner. That would be enough to give anyone chills. So it seems pretty hypocritical that it used to be common practice to perform community activities on the north or bad side of graveyards due to the absence of grave markers there. These activities included various sports and even dancing. There are also some things you should do around cemeteries. When you go past a graveyard or any place where someone has recently died, turn your pockets inside out so you don't carry a ghost home with you. Another thing you should do, according to a very popular superstition, is hold your breath when driving past a cemetery. Every breath can wake a spirit, make a spirit jealous, or allow a spirit to enter your body by breathing in the soul of someone who died. This superstition could also prevent you from whistling, which is helpful, because whistling inside a cemetery will summon the devil. Keep in mind, these are just rituals that make some people feel more comfortable with death and the afterlife. Superstitious thinking can become problematic when those rituals become obsessive or adversely affecting your life or decision-making in any way, or if you become insistent that others follow your superstitious beliefs. We all have a personal responsibility to recognize when something's harming our physical or mental health, or our relationships with others. But if you enjoy hearing more about superstitions, I also have a superstitions playlist, mostly from last Halloween, that I'll link in the description. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this topic and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you know of any other cemetery superstitions, leave them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.